Oh, sorry. Did you guys not know what I said? I said you can play fantasy esports and bet live on Worlds games at esports pools. It's just the video was reversed for some reason. Don't know why that would be. But it got your attention, so sort of too late, isn't it? That's a few seconds of your life gone, but some more skrill in this little homie's pocket, so too late, isn't it? So the Worlds groups and the system that they use for the Worlds groups within the Riot Games League of Legends World Championship approach is more broken than that intro there. Because today we had a situation where G2 was eliminated, and yet go and poll every expert, every top player, and you'll have a hard time finding people who thought G2 was actually bad in this tournament, or that G2 in other groups would not have gotten out. You just won't really find that. And so you ask yourself, then how was a number one seed from a major region in a position where it was actually unlikely they would get out? Now, the interesting thing is, some of the basic problems with the World's group system and how the seeds are drawn were actually brought up by me in a video 2 years ago around the Season 5 World Championship, when we had the groups made for that one and we had some ridiculous ones. So I won't summarize that entire video and go into all those details. You can go and watch the basic points there. But here are the key points that are relevant to understand for this video. So the pool system has obviously the first place seed from the major regions going into pool 1. And that immediately is a problem, because it's already going to skew the system that you treat the number one team from EU as equivalent to the number one team from Korea. Because remember, once you've made the pool, it's randomized. So number one from EU, when it's drawn into a group, is treated the exact same way as number one from Korea. That could also have been number one from Korea in that group. So if you're like the number 2 team from China who gets in that group, you could have had number one from EU as your number one seed, or you could have had number one from Korea. Now, which would you rather have? Pretty obvious, right? Not only does it treat the pool 1 teams as if they're equivalent, but then people forget that when you look at pool 2, which is essentially the 5th to 12th teams, as it were, within this system, it's putting people 5th to 12th, which means that within the system of how you do the World's draws, they're treated as if they're not as good and not as dangerous as the pool 1 teams. So as a result, you end up with AHQ and Misfits being treated identically to Samsung Galaxy and SK Telecom. You can get either of these teams as some of your pool 2 opponents, but even worse, you're treating Samsung Galaxy and SK Telecom as if they're worse and less dangerous than TSM, the number 1 team from America, G2 Esports, the number 1 team from Europe. And yet, again, go poll experts, they will all have Samsung Galaxy and SK Telecom ahead of G2 and TSM. So the system, again, is failing to account for reality. Now go, and you're thinking, come on, if the first 2 polls are that off, what can be such a big problem with pool 3? Same exact problem. It treats teams as equal who aren't at all equal. So remember, pool 3 includes teams that came through the play-in. Pool 3 treats treats WE as the same as Fenerbahce. Now, in no universe are WE and Fenerbahce close or around the same ranking if you take away this system and just rank the teams 1 to 16. Not only that, same problem again. When you then treat these teams as if they're equal, it means that you get an unfair scenario where people in Pool 2 are worse than people in Pool 3. So who in this tournament, regardless of how fun the games were, actually thinks Team WE is a worse team than Gigabyte Marines and AHQ, and coming into the tournament should be treated when drawing pools, drawing groups, as if they are worse. And yet the system inherently treats WE as if it is worse than Gigabyte Marines and AHQ. So you can get WE in your group in a world where you already have SK Telecom. Meanwhile, someone else can get Misfits and they can get Fenerbahce, and that's the system. Because remember, the system is blind to who these teams are. It's just looking at how you've set up the pools. It thinks those are equal groups. It thinks that's a fine resolution. That's a perfectly fine outcome to occur. It is in no sense a fine outcome to occur. That should not be possible. So moving beyond the issues I brought up in the other video, but obviously I've referenced them in a modern context for this tournament so people can appreciate them who weren't around in Season 5, there are other issues that are raised here that the pool system actually creates, but that people didn't necessarily appreciate before because we had to see it played out a few times to see how ridiculous it is. So for example, let's use the G2 case. G2 got a #1 seed from EU, and that in theory should get you a good group, and at very least, you'd think a better group than the #2 and the #3 seed from EU, right? Because you won your region, you're a pool 1 seed, the system's treating you as though you're dangerous and important. In theory, coming #1 and getting into pool 1 means you should be getting a better group, because you should be getting teams from the other pools. You won't have a pool 1 team in your group. But this is the problem, isn't it? Because you've treated all of pool 1 as equal, and you've treated everyone who's Korean but not #1 seed as not as good as pool 1, you can actually end up with scenarios where the way the system is currently designed, you get ultra fucked. Because remember, it's supposed to be a benefit that you can't get a #1 seed from another major region. And yet, G2 got the hardest team at this hardest group at this World Championship for any #1 seed. They got Samsung Galaxy, #3 Korean seed, but pool 2, because that's how the pool system works. They got RNG, #2 Korean seed, so pool 2 again. Those were their pool 2 teams. Remember, they could have had AHQ and Gigabyte Marines. That could also have been their group. So, because the system treats Koreans unfairly, we end up with fucked up groups like this. Remember, if you were to ask experts at Worlds, even the biased ones from any region, say to them, rank these teams 1 to 16. Right? Remember, within how the pool system works, you're putting TSM, G2, EDG as top 4 seeds in the current system, right? First of all, no expert would have those teams top 4. Secondly, when they were ranking teams 1 to 16, Pool 2 is sort of like being ranked 5th to 12th. Now, no one who's an expert would rank Samsung Galaxy 12th out of the 16 teams at Worlds. But this current pool system treats Samsung Galaxy as if they are either 5th or 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, going down to 12th. And it's randomized as to which they are within 5 to 12. So they can be treated like the 5th best team, which isn't so bad, or they can be treated like the 12th best team. And so you end up with scenarios like this, where you could get Gigabyte Marines, or you can get Samsung Galaxy. Yet, in any kind of ranking or normal seeding system, you would never be able to get a group like that. Likewise, if you were to do ranking 1 to 16, most experts would probably have RNG 4th. They'd probably have the 3 Korean teams and RNG. That would be their top 4. So RNG would never be able to be in this scenario. Now, you could make the argument, you could flip it around. They could be in a group with G2 because they could be the highest seed, and G2 could be that, yes. But you would never get a group that had G2 and Samsung Galaxy and RNG because of how these teams would be ranked. So RNG also would never be in a pool 2 scenario, except under this system where it's treating it as if it's blind, and then because you inputted incorrect data, it spits out incorrect results. So here's the problem. Now contrast G2 with the worst seed from Europe, seed 3, Fnatic, who only came in through the play-in. Fnatic got a group that actually ended up being a better chance to get out, and that they did get out of, and yet arguably they didn't even play as well as G2, because in their group they got the #1 Korean team. So Longju's the #1 Korean team, favourite for the tournament, and they just beat everyone in the group. Now, the other team that Fnatic was competing against, yes, they competed against Gigabyte Marines because Gigabyte Marines did an overperformance, but realistically, the other team Fnatic was competing against from the beginning and thus had a chance to get out of the group was they got their #2 seed. They got one of their pool 2 teams from NA. They got Immortals. Now, if you're Fnatic, a seed 3 team, pool 3, having Immortals and Gigabyte Marines as your 2 pool 2 teams to play gives you a way better chance to get out of the group as a 3rd seed than G2's pool 2 teams of Samsung Galaxy and RNG, and yet they're a #1 seed. Can you see the flaw with this system that we've got set up here? Fnatic pool 3 play-in team worse chance to get out the group than G2, who won their region, finished second at MSI, and made sure EU had a pool 1 seed spot. So this brings up an obvious flaw with the pool system. It treats the number 2, because remember, it's actually about what it does to all 3 of the Korean seeds that's so key. It treats the number 2 and number 3 Korean teams as worse than the number 1 EU team, and thus makes it possible to get harder groups for number 1 EU and number 1 NA than for lesser seeds from those regions. Because actually, this might seem counterintuitive, but having the number 1 Korean seed in your group as your number 1 seed is actually better if you're going to get Koreans anyway. So remember, 3 of the groups are definitely going to get Koreans, because in the current system, Koreans can't be in the same group. So 3 of the 4 groups are going to have Koreans in them, but you're actually better having the number 1 Korean team than any of the other Korean teams. Obviously, the ideal group is nearly always going to be to have no Korean teams, like TSM got this time. But in a world where you have to have it, so you're in 3 of the other 4 groups, it's actually better to have a number 1 Korean team, because since they're the number 1 team in the world, they're actually very likely going to win all the games in the group, and they're extremely likely to beat all the other teams. They might drop like 1 game, but generally they're going to beat all the other teams. So once they beat all the other teams and come out in first, you actually aren't competing against them. You're now only having to compete against 1 other team. You're competing against whoever the second best team in the group is, aside from you potentially. So in the case of Fnatic, you're competing against Immortals. That's not the case actually if you're in a group where the Korean team is a pool 2 one. Because now you can have a scenario like the RNG Samsung Galaxy one, where actually in theory, Samsung Galaxy is supposed to be the 3rd best team in that group, but they're very difficult, so is number 2, and so the number 1 ranked team in the group is actually not getting out of the group because the 2 teams they had were much harder, and one of the hardest draws you could have gotten. As an underdog, as I said, you only really have to beat 1 team in many of these instances if you get the number 1 Korean team. And so being the number 1 EU or NA team, can you mean you actually end up with 2 pretty strong teams in your group as well? So G2 this year with RNG Samsung Galaxy, TSM last year, they had RNG, Samsung Galaxy again in that scenario. The issue here is that people do care who goes the furthest at Worlds. I realize it shouldn't really, because actually if you ever go and look, how far you make it at Worlds is just based on when you meet a Korean team in the bracket. But things like getting out of groups, because of the way tournaments work in esports, that does feel like if you're a number 1 seed, well, yeah, if you don't get out of the groups, that does feel like you failed, right? But the problem is the way this system is set up means that you're not in a fair situation. So getting out of groups is a big deal for number 1 seeds, and yet this system pretends you benefit from a number 1 seed. I mean, you do in the case of TSM, but for most of the other number 1 seeds that aren't the Korean one, you actually can end up sometimes in a worse scenario. That's what's ridiculous about it. So TSM last year would likely have gotten out of a number of the other groups. I mean, almost certainly out of the group that was Cloud9, SK Telecom, Flash Wolves. This year, G2 arguably would get out of any group, but almost certainly would have gotten out of Fnatic's group if they'd have been in a position where, remember, if you'd have thrown them into that group, so take Fnatic and put that within a team, that could have been Fenerbahce, and then they could have had Gigabyte Marines, and they still could have had Immortals. That could have been their group, and then they would be in the round of 8, and they could have played identically in terms of the actual, their performance level, not obviously the picks and how they would have played specific opponents. And we'd now be praising them, top 8 at Worlds, what an accomplishment. And yet the system is what's fucked them here, not how they've played. It's not that they couldn't meet the challenge. The challenge was much harder for them than it was for teams who are lower ranked and in lower pools from their region and others. So teams prep all year long to get to Worlds. It's the most important tournament. It's the tournament of your career. Sometimes you might only make it once. For example, my favorite player, Flame, this is only the 2nd time he's ever made Worlds, and last time was as a sub. So it's important how these pools are drawn, and if you even have a chance to get to the bracket and feel like you ever accomplished something. And yet, first of all, we get completely random draws in pools. So we act as though, did you get Seed 1 Korea? Tough shit. That could have been Seed 1 from LMS. How's this reasonable? Then you get in a world where you have super difficult groups for top teams, and then their fans are like, losers, you didn't get out of your group, like you thought you were the best in your region. Well, they were. They had a harder group. So what are some solutions to this problem, right? First of all, this is something I mentioned in the other video. For the pools themselves, having pools that wide is also an issue. Like the idea that you just take the 5th to 12th teams, not really, because in no universe is Samsung like 5th and yet Flash Wolves are above them. But let's say you took 5th to 12th. Why the hell would you treat number 5 as if it was the same as number 12? So even if you're going to do random pools, make more pools. Like I said before, I don't know what the number would be, I haven't run the numbers on it, but make 4 pools or 6 pools or 8 pools. Therefore, you could have, in the concept of what used to be pool 2, you'd have a top pool within there that's still going to be top teams out of pool 2, so RNG, Samsung Galaxy. I mean, I guess in this scenario, you can't have SK Telecoms, so we have to put them in the one below. But the point is, in the bottom pool of what would have been pool 3, in the bottom tier of that, is where Gigabyte Marines and AHQ would be, etc. That would be a reasonable way to set it up, because it would take out some of these issues. It would make it less likely that this can happen overall. Then you go ahead, and you also can consider using real seeding, rank the teams 1 to 16, then make a group that's 1 and 16 and the other 2, then make another group that's number 2 and 15 and another 2. That's another way you can do it, because it's already bullshit the idea that you're going to treat number 1 Korea as number 1 NA. They're just identical teams of equal strength, are they? They're not in any way. I would personally just get rid of the whole regional dodge thing where you can't have 2 Koreans and you can't have 2 Chinese, because I actually think, first of all, you generally make worse groups with this system. And then secondly, even when you make groups that have 2 EU and 2 NA, because they're the obvious regions that are going to meet. The obvious regions that will meet is EU, NA, and LMS. They're the regions that are probably going to have 2 teams every now and then that get the same group. China, not so much, because they're going to be fairly high ranked. Korea, never, because Korea is going to be in the top 4 or 5 with all 3 seeds. So they're never going to be in the same group. China, not so much. Here's the thing. If you're EU and NA and LMS, it might seem like it's, well, why do I want to go to Worlds and play teams from the same region? That's the argument, right, as to why you made it. But here's the thing. Playing other EU and NA teams, as we've just outlined here, actually gives you a better chance to get out of the group. So even if you do play each other and you're from the same region, you actually get fairer groups and a better chance to get out. So the issue of them playing, we wait all year and then play each other from the same region, well, yeah, but first of all, one of you can make it out, whereas otherwise, actually, neither of you might make it out if you get 2 really bad groups. Secondly, that's a problem, a byproduct of too few international tournaments, which is a very difficult topic and it's its own video, because the circuit is already absolutely rammed and packed with how LCS works, and people are overworked and burned out. So I'm not one of those people who just says, ram in more international tournaments no matter what. No, you've got to change the whole system fundamentally. So I'll just say that's why you shouldn't go ahead and do this system with the regional dodge in that sense. So there are a lot of problems with these broken groups, and I really hope they address it, because it's not only messing up where people finish in the tournament, but the expectations are totally off. Because actually in this scenario, G2 playing well but not making it out of their group is a good performance, yet they didn't even make top 8. Meanwhile, someone like Fnatic had a decent performance, a pretty decent performance, but they're going to be top 8 when even they would probably acknowledge they're a worse team and probably overall played worse than G2. So this is quite a difficult scenario, and these problems aren't just one-offs. First of all, they happen every year, and they are inherent flaws of the system where, because incorrect data and a terrible systems used, the computer of the process spits out these ridiculous groups and these terrible problems.
Welcome to Thorns and Thoughts. Unfortunately, I don't have any content. The man already speaks his mind, but I ain't gonna stop you now. I assume you saw a pretty fucking good video. Alright? And you're already on the man's channel. So stay a little while longer. I see you're comfortable. And just check a few more out.